between the time when the life cycle of the Age of Kings ended and the rise of the Chiefs of War, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this Age of Empires fans wore the question of the game's time frame upon troubled brows. It is I, Age of Discovery, who alone can tell thee of the answer. Let me tell you of the time frame of Age of Empires 3.
We are back with the finale to the three-part series on the Age of Empires 3 time frame. Today we'll go over a few corrections to my previous videos, summarize everything, then provide the definitive answer to what the Age of Empires 3 time frame is. Okay, maybe not definitive, but my answer. Let's get into some mystery. If you haven't seen my first two videos on the evidence towards the start and end dates, please go watch those. Or if you just want a refresher, please go take a look. We're going to kickstart things with corrections. Believe it or not, I am fallible. There were some great comments that were left on the first two videos. One of you wonderful viewers, the fantastic Wars of Liberty dev, a hoop thrower, pointed out in a comment that I had missed 3 Asian units that belong outside of a 1419 start date, and in a second comment pointed out that I had omitted Neftenyas. And per Gideon AI, an expert on Age of Empires 3 numbers and figures, there is a new South Africa card that factors in, as well as a Finnish Revolution card that I missed. Hoop Thrower and Gideon bring up great points. Let's look into these. Starting with the anachronistic or legendary Asian units, I went on some deep rabbit holes when researching these, so I'm going to keep this section short and come back to them in a later video in full. The first is the Flying Crow. A 1412 military treatise describes a gunpowder bomb called Divine Fire Flying Crow, reportedly of gunpowder weaponry encountered on tours through China. How long it was used is unknown, but the manual it was referenced in was updated as late as 1632. Proper cannons were also in use in China at this time, developed around the same time as the Flying Crow, with great general cannons in mass production in the 1370s, but the design of indigenous Chinese cannons stagnated until European designs were imported in the 16th century. The longevity of Flying Crows is suspect, as it was likely eclipsed by these Chinese cannons, but cannot be definitively eliminated since the treatise was updated and published until the Qing dynasty banned it. And given that the treatise was first published in 1412, it is possible that the Flying Crows were still in use into the 1420s. How about the flamethrower? Chinese manuscripts indicate that the first flamethrowers, developed based on knowledge of Greek fire imported from the Byzantines, were in use starting in 919 AD, with them being mounted to pushcarts in 1044 and recorded use in combat in 1126, deployed at the Great Wall by the Song dynasty to ward off the Mongols. I bet that worked out great. They are cited in use as late as 1253 and are described in manuscripts as late as 1609. Similar to the Flying Crow, there is no evidence that it was in use by even the earliest AOE3 start date, and was likely eclipsed by newer gunpowder weapons and the like. But the weapon cannot be definitively eliminated since it is described in manuscripts as late as 1609. The third and final of these units is the Indian Flail Elephant. Per the in-game compendium, although there are few accounts to substantiate its existence, the Flail Elephant was said to have been a cavalry and siege unit, fielded with the early armies of Sri Lanka. Well, if that's not concrete evidence, I don't know what is. Okay, yeah, that's pretty terrible, actually. But there are some sparse indications of its use in literature. In one scholarly article from 1985, a 1955 display occurred where war elephants struck with lengths of chains weighted at either end with iron bars, and then hypothesizing, This strange contraption must have been some kind of lethal flail coming down in use from antiquity. So there is indication of elephants trained to use flails in combat as late as 1955, albeit as a demonstration for essentially a carnival. The author's hypothesis may feel far-fetched, but there is attested use of elephants using clubs or similar weapons as early as 283 BC. There are actually paintings of elephants using chains as flails in the 1700s, like this painting that is on the screen now. And Portuguese records from their colonization attempts in the 16th century, notably the 1587 Siege of Colombo and the 1559 Battle of Muliryawa, indicate that some Sri Lankan elephants were trained to use swords. So, elephants wielding weapons with their trunks in combat in the 1500s is actually attested to. And the use of a flail as late as 1955, post-World War II. Kinda nutty. With a mild amount of disbelief, we can actually state that flail elephants are accurate to the time period of AOE3. However, that doesn't make sense for these to be fielded en masse. But hey, it's a game. Next is additional evidence to be considered towards the end date. There are 4 new items for us to look at. The first is the Cudgel War card available with the Finnish Revolt, which appropriately boosts hand infantry combat. This was a 1596 to 1597 peasant uprising in Finland, which was then a part of Sweden. This was in response to an intolerable tax burden imposed on the peasants in Finland, where squires were provided for at peasants' expense. While it's called the Cudgel War, these peasants weren't just fighting with sticks. While most were armed with spears and axes, and yes, cudgels, some had bear guns. Yeah, for killing bears. It ended the way most peasant revolts did. The nobles admitted they were wrong and made the lives of the peasants better. Just kidding. The peasants were brutally suppressed and their villages plundered. As one does. The second card is the Radzal, a card available in the South Africa Revolt. The Radzal, or Old Council Hall, housed the Parliament of the South African Republic from 1891, when it was finished, to 1902, when the British won the Second Boer War and annexed the territory. This card appropriately enables you to build a capital. Notably for our purposes, this is after the conclusion of the First Boer War. The third item is Neftenyas. This is the H4 skirmisher unit available to the Ethiopians. Neftenyas were settler soldiers in the Kingdom of Shiwa, later the Ethiopian Empire. These were aristocrats and their employed soldiers who, under Menelik II, conquered southern independent states and became their feudal lords. Neftenyas were used in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Records are sparse, with the first clear mention in 1886. Interestingly, Neftenya is now used as an ethnic slur against the Amhara people in Ethiopia. This made researching this topic rather difficult, as, you know, it's the internet, and probably put me on a watch list somewhere. Yay. The fourth and final is the Indonesia Revolution, available to the Portuguese and Dutch. Indonesia did not formally gain its independence until 1949, but that's a little far-fetched for AOE, and that's saying something. The Revolution cards and units reference 2 events that are in the 1800s. The first is the Java Spearmen, which is the revolutionary unit. This is a reference to the 1825 to 1830 Java War, a guerrilla campaign against the Dutch led by Indonesian folk hero Prince Diponegoro. The second is the card Assa Pepper exports. The Sultanate of Assa was an independent power on the island of Sumatra, which is at war with the Dutch from 1873 until 1913, when it was subjugated. Assa was wealthy and coveted by the Dutch because of its black pepper. While both of these conflicts were won by the Dutch, these were armed conflicts against colonizers, and allow us to comfortably place the Indonesian revolt within the conservative date range. So how do these 7 references affect our date ranges? The Cudgel War, along with other cards like Grand Duchy of Finland, firmly establishes the Finnish revolt as pre-1876, as the Cudgel War was in the late 16th century. The earliest we can place Neftenya's is at 1886 with the first historical record, and Radzal provides a clear African-themed reference to the 1890s, as it entered service in 1891, and its inclusion provides some indication that the Second Boer War may be in the game's timeframe, and gives us enough evidence to say that the Finnish Revolt and Indonesian Revolt do not occur after 1901. On the other hand, the 3 Asian units discussed, the Flail Elephant, Flying Crow, and Flamethrower, are a tad problematic. Get it? Because TAD, TAD, the Asian dynasties. Okay, anyways. The TAD problem. Including evidence from the Asian dynasties expansion is inherently precarious. The 3 units discussed all have tenuous links to any point in the Age of Empires 3 timeframe, and appear to require a bit of reaching. Of all 3, strangely, Flail Elephants seem to be the most reasonable inclusion. As Hoop Thrower stated, design seems to have been focused on the exotic over historicity. Another example of this is the Beiyang Army card, available in Age 3, sends cavalry units, whereas the real Beiyang Army was primarily infantry. This means we have to consider if the most questionable pieces of evidence should be excluded from use when answering the question, or if TAD evidence should be excluded entirely. So, with all of the new evidence assembled, what else do we need to consider before jumping to conclusions? One big thing to consider is the principle of evidence of absence. Or, to put it another way, proving a negative. As I mentioned in part 1, the Spanish attempted to use a trebuchet and failed miserably in 1521, which no one will question being included in the period of Age of Empires 3. But trebuchets are not in the game at all. As we are considering the evidence here regarding dates, we must look for evidence of absence. We have to prove a negative for these omissions. Thus, substantial proof is required to assert that the timeline begins or ends because certain techs or units are not present in the game. So in this case, the absence of trebuchets does not preclude including dates prior to 1521, as there is sufficient evidence of events prior to 1521 in the game, not the least of which is the inclusion of the Aztecs as a playable civ, given that their empire ceased to exist in 1521. And this must weigh into our reasoning. Another concept we must consider is theme. While much more subjective by definition, the themes of Age of Empires 3 must weigh into this discussion, particularly that of major powers engaging in gunpowder warfare across oceans, exploring and settling new lands. So when we consider events not referenced in game, we must weigh if the themes in the game revolve around certain events. Okay, with all that stuff out of the way, let's finally get to the actual conclusion. Let's start by assessing the most conservative date range of 1492 to 1876. What evidence is in favor of this most restrictive time frame? Quite frankly, not much. In the early days of Age of Empires 3, the 1492 to 1876 date worked well. At the initial launch in 2005, when the focus was entirely on the Americas. 1492 made sense, as that's when the Americas were first explored, and when revolutions and the Sioux campaigns were added with the war chiefs, established an end date of 1876. But with the release of the Asian dynasties in 2007, which added Asia as a theater, and with the raft of changes introduced by the Definitive Edition, including Africa in the African Royals expansion, and Europe in the Knights of the Mediterranean expansion, the game is no longer exclusively focused on the Americas, and hasn't been since 2007. Because of this, the Timeframe must consider events occurring outside of the Americas. As far as a start date of 1492 goes, while it does fit thematically, considering Columbus's discovery of the Americas, and almost all of the in-game references start in or include 1492 or later, it excludes at least 2 concrete references. While the Chinese campaign can be argued against given that it is fictional, and Yeoman can be argued against given that it's a vague timeline, the Onan War ended in 1477, and Henry the Navigator died in 1460. From a broader thematic perspective, the Age of Discovery was already in progress before 1492. Likewise, an end date of 1876 is fundamentally flawed due to the large number of references in-game that occur after 1876. While the date of 1876 does include most revolutions, and new technologies in the game do not progress beyond this date, we must consider what evidence exists against these omissions. Given that substantial evidence of dates after 1876 is present in-game, there is no evidence of absence. With all of the evidence, we must rule out the conservative time frame of 1492 to 1876. That leaves 2 date ranges for us to consider: the moderate date range of 1453 to 1884, and the liberal date range of 1419 to 1901. What distinguishes these two? What references does the moderate date range exclude? And is it accurate to label those exclusions as anachronistic? Let's consider the start dates of 1419 versus 1453. The only in-game reference exclusive to this period is the fictional Chinese campaign. The campaign does reference the real-world Ming treasure ship expeditions and is in the campaign, so it may need to be weighted heavily due to its prevalence in the single-player experience. But likewise, the characters and portrayed events are fictional, and therefore it can be faithfully argued that the campaign should be excluded from evidence. It is a reasonable position to exclude the Chinese campaign as false evidence, as it is in the same vein as flying crows and flamethrowers, as inherently suspect due to lack of documentation and fictional aspects. Returning to the concept of theme, what fits the game better? The start of the Age of Discovery in 1419, or the fall of Constantinople in 1453? That's an open question still. 1419 lines up with the themes of exploration and settling of unknown lands. 1453 aligns with the establishment of the Ottomans as a real threat to other European powers and the escalating drive to find new trade routes. What about the end dates of 1884 versus 1901? What events referenced in Age of Empires 3 fall into this 17-year period? As stated in Part 2, there is a soft reference to the First Italo-Ethiopian War, but this is potentially construed to reference earlier events. There are, however, 4 hard points of evidence. The Radzil card is one with a reference date of 1891. Another is Neftenya's, with an earliest date of 1886. The other two originate from China and are subject to that TAD problem, the Beiyang Army and Boxer Rebellion. As stated earlier, Beiyang Army is a little suspect, whereas Boxer Rebellion, on the other hand, has a clear tie-in to the real-life event. Regarding technologies that are omitted, use of electricity and the end of Age of Sail are the most significant ones. Sailing ships were falling out of relevance, and electricity was not widespread in 1884, whereas in 1901, warships no longer carried sails at all, and electricity was accessible in many major cities. So what do I think the date range of Age of Empires 3 is? What is the conclusion? Given all the evidence and arguments presented, I assert that the liberal date range of 1419 to 1901 is the correct one. It contains all events that can be linked, at least tenuously, to any non-legendary references. Concerning the TAD problem, we cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. Cards like Onin War and Boxer Rebellion are clear references to events, and their effects have a clear relation to these real-life events. And the Chinese campaign cannot be entirely excluded, as the Ming treasure fleet did exist and did go on an expedition in 1421, and as depicted in the campaign, visited India. There are valid concerns with an end date of 1901, given the lack of references to the latest technologies in 1900. But there is clear evidence that the date range extends to 1899 at the minimum, and therefore we must consider the technologies missing as of 1900 to be anachronistic omissions rather than evidence of absence. 3 Home City cards, Radzal, Boxer Rebellion, and Beiyang Army, and the Neftenia unit, require an end date of no earlier than 1899. From a thematic perspective, a timeline bracketed by the beginning of the Age of Discovery and the end of the Victorian era works really well. Starting with the beginning of the Age of Discovery allows the game to include the first European voyages into the unknown and the first settlements of overseas lands, as well as the efforts of the Ming dynasty to re-establish the tributary system, and much more. Ending with the close of the Victorian era has the game conclude with the final colonization efforts, like the death of the Spanish Empire and the emergence of the American one, and the final European colonial expansion in Africa and China. Therefore, the time frame of Age of Empires 3 is from 1419 to 1901. Thanks for listening to me spiel on for all this time. But now, tell me, what do you think? Are the technological omissions significant enough to warrant omitting the Scramble for Africa or the Boxer Rebellion? Are there references to the period between 1419 and 1492 that I missed? Should the anachronistic inclusion with the Asian dynasties discredit the associated cards and campaigns as evidence, meaning the start date should be 1453? Do you have any evidence to dispute any of this? If so, please let me know in the comments. I actually loved seeing that and would love to have further updates to show people. Lastly, what sort of historical deep dives would you like to learn about from Age of Empires 3? German colonization in Venezuela? All of Mexico's revolts? I'm definitely putting together a video on flying crows, flamethrowers, and flail elephants. Let me know what you would like to see. Thanks for listening. Now go and play some Age of Empires.